Imagine waking up to the sound of howling winds, rain hammering against windows, and a sky that remains permanently dark. Days turn into weeks, but the storm never lets up. This isn't just another extreme weather event, this is the new reality. A superstorm that never ends, an unstoppable force reshaping life on Earth. For years, scientists have warned about the growing power of storms, but no one expected something like this. Climate change had already pushed hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones to their limits, fueling stronger winds and heavier rains. Then, conditions aligned in a way that no one had ever seen before. A perfect storm formed, a system so large and intense that it became locked in place, endlessly feeding off the ocean's warmth and the atmosphere's moisture. At first, it seemed like a typical hurricane. Meteorologists tracked its path, governments issued warnings, and people prepared to evacuate. But days passed, and instead of weakening, the storm grew stronger. The eye of the storm, where calm conditions usually appear, disappeared entirely. Winds reached speeds never recorded before, tearing through cities with relentless force. The storm surge pushed inland, swallowing coastal towns whole. Air travel came to a halt, ships were lost at sea, roads vanished under floodwaters. Millions of people tried to flee, only to find themselves trapped. As highways turned into rivers and bridges collapsed under the strain, emergency response teams were overwhelmed. Power grids failed, plunging entire regions into darkness. Food supplies dwindled as stores ran out of essentials, and farms were left in ruins. As days turned into weeks, scientists realized something terrifying. This storm wasn't going away. It had become self-sustaining, locked in a feedback loop that kept it alive. The planet's rising temperatures had created the perfect conditions for a never-ending storm, and without a way to disrupt it, humanity faced a future where the weather was no longer just unpredictable, it was unstoppable. As the weeks stretched on, the superstorm became more than just a weather event. It became a force of nature that reshaped the planet. The atmosphere, now permanently unstable, continued feeding the storm with warm air and moisture. Scientists scrambled to understand why it wasn't dissipating, but every attempt to predict its end resulted in the same answer. There was no end. With no sunlight breaking through the thick storm clouds, temperatures dropped in some regions, while others experienced an unnatural humidity that made survival unbearable. Crops failed as floodwaters drowned entire farmlands. Areas that relied on seasonal rain patterns faced a new challenge: too much water, too fast. The constant deluge washed away topsoil, turning fertile land into useless swamplands. Without agriculture to sustain them, supply chains collapsed and food shortages turned into a global crisis. Coastal cities suffered the worst. Massive storm surges swallowed entire neighborhoods, turning once thriving metropolitan areas into flooded wastelands. Saltwater intrusion contaminated freshwater supplies, leaving millions without drinkable water. Inland regions weren't spared either. Rivers overflowed, dams failed, and landslides buried towns under mud and debris. The constant battering of high-speed winds tore buildings apart, leaving behind skeletal remains of once strong structures. Governments struggled to maintain order, evacuations turned chaotic, as roads remained impassable and airports remained shut down indefinitely. Military forces were deployed for rescue operations, but even they were limited by the storm's relentless power. Satellites captured haunting images from space, an enormous, unbroken swirl of clouds covering vast portions of the Earth. It was no longer just a superstorm, it had become the defining feature of the planet's climate. With communication lines down in many regions, isolated communities were left to fend for themselves. In some places, the storm created permanent refugees, millions of people forced to abandon their homes, seeking shelter in underground bunkers, reinforced buildings, or any place that could offer even temporary protection. The world was rapidly changing, and for the first time in human history, civilization faced a battle against a storm that had no end in sight. As the superstorm persisted, the world's infrastructure faced an unprecedented collapse. Roads and bridges, weakened by unrelenting floods and hurricane-force winds, crumbled into the rising waters. Railways twisted and snapped, cutting off vital supply routes. Airports, once hubs of global travel and trade, became abandoned ruins buried under debris. Without functional transportation networks, delivering emergency aid to affected regions became nearly impossible. Entire nations were plunged into darkness as power grids failed under the stress of constant lightning strikes, fallen transmission towers, and waterlogged electrical systems. The lack of electricity created a new crisis. Hospitals, unable to sustain their operations, ran out of backup power. Life-saving machines shut down, and critical medications spoiled without refrigeration. The world's healthcare systems, already strained, collapsed under the sheer number of injuries, infections, and illnesses brought on by the storm. Contaminated floodwaters became breeding grounds for deadly diseases, spreading infections at a rate never seen before. With hospitals overwhelmed, survivors were left to rely on makeshift clinics, volunteer medical teams, or whatever supplies they could scavenge. Meanwhile, the Earth's geography itself began to shift. Entire coastlines disappeared as erosion accelerated, swallowing entire towns. Riverbanks widened unnaturally, permanently altering landscapes. Deserts, once arid and lifeless, saw unexpected storms carving deep canyons into their surfaces. Some mountain ranges faced continuous landslides, reshaping their terrain in real time. Scientists monitoring satellite data confirmed that the planet's weather systems had entered a state of permanent chaos. The psychological impact on humanity was staggering. With no sign of the storm weakening, hopelessness spread as fast as the floodwaters. Some communities turned to desperate measures, forming isolated enclaves and defending their resources against outsiders. Others abandoned their homes entirely, seeking shelter in underground facilities, abandoned subway systems, or deep caves. Governments, struggling to maintain order, enacted martial law in an attempt to stop widespread looting and violence. Despite the chaos, efforts to adapt began. Engineers worked on storm-proof structures designed to withstand constant battering. Scientists searched for ways to manipulate the atmosphere, hoping to break the storm cycle. Plans were made to construct floating cities, using advanced technology to create sustainable habitats above the floodwaters. Yet with resources stretched thin and survival the top priority, the question remained, was there any real hope of escaping a storm that refused to end? As the world adjusted to the reality of a never-ending superstorm, survival became a test of human resilience and ingenuity. With no hope of the storm dissipating, scientists focused on radical solutions to stabilize the atmosphere. Some proposed large-scale geoengineering projects, such as injecting aerosols into the upper atmosphere to alter weather patterns, or constructing massive ocean barriers to disrupt storm formation. However, these plans carried immense risks. Tampering with the planet's delicate climate balance could lead to even worse consequences. With much of the land rendered uninhabitable, new methods of living had to be developed. Some of the wealthiest nations and corporations invested in constructing self-sustaining floating cities. Designed to ride out the endless waves, these structures, built from advanced materials, housed entire communities, complete with hydroponic farms, desalination plants, and wind-powered energy sources. Those who couldn't access such technology sought refuge underground, carving out survival bunkers beneath mountains, inside abandoned mines, or in deep cave networks where the wind and rain couldn't reach. The superstorm had reshaped human civilization. Entire countries were abandoned, their once thriving populations either drowned, displaced, or forced to migrate. Old political boundaries became meaningless, replaced by scattered survival zones. Some nations, desperate to maintain order, became authoritarian regimes, controlling dwindling resources with an iron grip. Others collapsed entirely, leaving behind lawless wastelands where only the strongest survived. Amidst the chaos, a small but determined group of researchers continued to search for answers. Studying atmospheric data from the few remaining satellites, they noticed unusual patterns forming in the storm's structure. Some theorized that the extreme climate shifts had created a self-sustaining weather system, one that could only be disrupted by a dramatic environmental shift, perhaps the eruption of a massive volcano or a planetary cooling event. However, triggering such an event deliberately was dangerous and unpredictable. Despite the odds, humanity refused to give up. Survival became the only goal, and people adapted in ways once thought impossible. The world as it had been was gone, reshaped by the storm's wrath. Cities lay submerged, landscapes permanently altered, and the future remained uncertain. Yet as long as there were people willing to fight for survival, there was still hope, even in a world where the storm never ended.